is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. He thought Orcus would be a killer name for a metal band, Stu Horvath.
Hold on, I gotta plug that into Google and see if Orcus is the name of a metal band.
Well, in fairness, if you look at modern metal logos nowadays, who could tell? I can't understand half the words that are spelled out on the page in front of me.
They are a blackened death metal band out of Glendale, California, active from 2003 to the present. And there's also another death metal band called Orcus.
Every good name is taken.
Yeah, it's true. Well, this one's got a lot of history to it, so it makes sense.
And today we are going to talk about the history of Orcus.
So when I started really getting into Dungeons & Dragons, it was 2nd edition, and I felt like Orcus was like the villain. He's like paunchy Baphomet, right?
Exactly.
Like he's got like the goat head and the beer belly and the cool wand with the skull at the end. So like, what's not to love, right?
Yeah, he's chunky Baphomet.
But like he was everywhere, and his priests were cool too because they wore like robes. They had like the goat head on top of their head.
It's like a hat on a hat to a degree.
And I don't know. I feel like Orcus was just one of those things that was like a bit of the zeitgeist when I was coming up. And he was a little bit all over the place. He wasn't like a Strahd kind of level villain, but like he was around and people knew his name and he was cool. So I thought it would be cool to kind of look at who he is and kind of walk through his history real quick because, you know, we like cool stuff.
We do like cool stuff. And I'll be very honest with you. Anytime I've ever encountered Orcus in any kind of media, I've always thought to myself, well, I'm definitely not going to survive that fight.
He's terrifying. I always thought it was interesting that he was like a big sort of goat man, but he was like Lord of the Undead. You know, you would think that the Lord of the Undead would be like a big skull man. And I always thought it was interesting that he wasn't.
Well, I'm going to say when you look like Orcus, you could be lord over whatever you want to be.
It's true. So when I was doing some research for this episode, I was surprised at how far back Orcus goes in like real life history. I actually always thought that he was just, you know, a D&D creature and that the us at the end was just sort of like, let's make it sound Latin. But it actually turns out that he is one of the several gods of the Roman and Etruscan underworld. So going back, you know, thousands of years. And I feel like Greek and Roman mythology exists in my mind as like the digests of mythology that I read as a kid. And it's a very simplified sort of version of what is actually a really complicated and intricate religious system. You know, like I kind of knew that there were different gods of the underworld, but I just never thought about it until like, I don't know, a couple days ago when we first started talking about doing this episode. So like usually you think of like Hades or Pluto as being like Lord of the Underworld, but no, Orcus is down there too. And he was the god of punishing oath breakers.
Oh, that sounds so cool.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, it's so cool. And his name was also synonymous with the underworld. So he was both a name of a personage and a place.
Really?
Yeah. So like, yeah, go to Orcus, man.
You go to Orcus.
Doesn't really have the same.
Yeah. Doesn't roll off the tongue as smooth as HE double hockey sticks.
Yeah. So another thing that's really interesting about Orcus, the mythological figure, is he was often depicted as a big hairy dude. And there's a little bit of conflicting ideas about why this is. That might be a more modern misunderstanding where there was like a tomb or a temple that they found somewhere in Italy and they thought it was associated with Orcus, and there was like a painting of a cyclops in there and he's a big hairy dude. So when I'm saying like more modern, I'm saying like late Roman Empire, like the early medieval period where they're just like, well, this must be Orcus. And we're not really sure that that's what he was thought of in the early days, but at a certain point he became associated with big hairy dude. And this is interesting because he wasn't a city god, he was a rural god. So because of that, the worship of him sort of like after the fall of the empire and stuff, like it was the city gods that sort of fell into disuse immediately, and the rural gods sort of lasted. And Orcus, in different ways, he survives into the medieval period and he turns into like this wild man of the woods figure that you could kind of connect to Gawain and the Green Knight, and you can connect him to the Green Man, which is like the man of leaves and stuff that you find in English churches and French churches, and the Wood Woes, and just this idea of like a crazy, big, hairy dude that just runs around the woods. And I mean, you could probably make a parallel to like the idea of like a Bigfoot kind of thing too.
Or a Jersey Devil.
Yeah, and he becomes like this sort of like medieval cryptid. And that's sort of like this continuing evolution of tradition of this god of the underworld. And you're probably asking like, what does this have to do with D&D and fantasy in general?
How did you read my mind?
I'm going to tell you, Hambone. This is super interesting. What are the first three letters of his name?
ORC.
Yeah. So, this idea of a wild man of the woods, if you look at the way the languages develop and such, from Latin into French and English, Orcus is the root of the word ogre. And there's also in some medieval and Renaissance legerdemain, there's the idea of the Orco, which is sort of like this goblin demon, which eventually becomes Tolkien's orcs.
That is wild.
Yeah. And orcs have always been sort of the fantasy critter that I never quite understood. They're not like kobolds or goblins because like they're obviously taken directly from folklore. But the orc, especially like the pigman kind of orc, always kind of like confounded me because I never really saw orcs mentioned in the same way that I would see like brownies or gremlins or goblins or bugbears even in more traditional folklore. But this is how they came in. And this is why they're sort of like a force in fantasy. It's all because of this interesting little evolution involving like crazy people in the woods.
That's bonkers. I love old stories, and I love how old stories kind of mutate and take on their own special forms through the retelling through the years. So this is blowing my mind.
Yeah. And granted, I didn't do a super ton of deep research in this. This might be a case of like James Fraser's Golden Bough, where he kind of like saw patterns that make sense and they're so interesting and intriguing, but they don't actually exist. That might be the case here. But the fact that I did read notes from Tolkien and a letter to Gene Wolfe in which he mentions the underworld god Orcus as being the source of the word orc. So that much at least is true. And if that much is true, I feel like the rest of it it's feasible.
Right.
But like, as with everything else, take this with a grain of salt. I'm sure we'll have a conversation with our listeners and somebody will tell me the truth.
Yeah. Someone will jump in the Discord and be like, well, actually.
Yeah.
And don't be that guy, folks. But
No. I mean, don't well actually be, but I do like to know the real thing. But from what I know, right at this moment, I think that this is super fascinating. Oh, and I can't believe I almost forgot this because it's one of my favorite things. In Italy, in Orsini, there is a thing called the Park of Monsters, which
what?
is so cool. It was built during the Renaissance in the 16th century. And it wasn't meant to be like a park of peaceful contemplation. It was meant to be a park that shocked you. So there's all these fantastic statues of monsters.
I want to go to there.
Yes. And there's a really famous one, and I'll try and remember to put it in the show notes when we post this. It's called the Mouth of Orcus. And it's sort of famous. It's like this big head that sort of has the mouth open and it's screaming. I think it's been sort of repurposed since then as a graphic depiction of like the entryway to hell.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, but I think that's probably the most famous real world depiction of Orcus of any really great age.
Well, it's funny because I'm looking at the photo now. I brought the photo up. I'm taking a look at the photo, and it's horrifying.
Yeah.
Like, if I walk into a park, and I'm like, oh, tra-la-la, it's a nice day in the park. I'm going to have a little picnic. What is that? It's the gates of hell. Like, we have a thing in New Jersey actually called the Gates of Hell. You could actually check it out if you follow Weird New Jersey. They've talked about the Gates of Hell. However, it's just like a tunnel that goes, like, into, like, a sewer. It's like, it's legendary for various and many nefarious reasons. However, it doesn't look like the Gates of Hell. Like, the Mouth of Orcus looks like the actual literal entrance to HE double hockey sticks.
Yeah, and like if you stumbled upon the Park of Monsters without knowing what you were getting yourself into, you would be like floored. You would think that you stumbled into a Dungeons and Dragons game.
Oh my god, it's awesome.
Yeah, it's so great. And I think that this is something that's amplified for us because we're Americans. We aren't surrounded by things of great age like this, but you can tell just by looking at that picture that it's centuries old. It's like covered in moss and it just like has that weather-worn look that you get from being that old. And I think that's sort of just super impressive for me because, I live in Kearney. I think everything here is like 50 years old.
It is, but it's old in that way, like we just can't find a good way or reason to knock down that wall. Whereas, like in Europe, I've been all over Ireland, I've been all over the UK. They're like, oh, here, look at these beautiful old structures. And I know this is true for other parts of Europe as well. They're like, we're going to honor and cherish this. The Royal Mile in Scotland, like, this is history. We're not putting a condo here.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, who'd want to?
In America, forget it. There'd be a mall and a 7-Eleven.
So I think that I've seen this as an illustration. On the upper lip, it says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." I believe on the statue in the Park of Monsters, it actually says, "All reason departs," which I think is actually better.
Yeah, my God.
So all this brings us up to Orcus as a figure of import in the Dungeons and Dragons game. And I feel like all of this that we've talked about kind of makes him loom even larger than I previously kind of imagined. He's sort of like the father of orcs and ogres and a large part of like the kind of mythology that D&D plays with. So that already kind of made him extra interesting to me.
It does make him larger than life, knowing that he is from where all these great and many creatures have been derived.
Yeah. So he appears first in Eldritch Wizardry in 1976, which is a supplement for the original Dungeons and Dragons box set. Right from the start, he's basically recognizable pot-bellied, goat-headed Orcus with his wand. I don't really know who created him. I believe Gygax wrote that book along with Brian Bloom, but there aren't clear credits. Somebody will probably email me to weigh in, but he springs forth pretty much recognizable. I mean, the illustration for it, his first appearance is awful, but he's the same Orcus that shows up in the first Monster Manual and, is recognizable right up through the modern editions. Does he have a potbelly in 5th edition?
So in 5th edition, it's interesting. So he does kind of have a potbelly, but he also kind of has a cummerbund with a skull on it and what looks like the remnants of a kilt.
All right, kilts are cool. I'm Scottish. I like that.
Yeah, me too. And he's got like a skull that he wears as like a face mask over his face. And he's got the wings and he's got a scepter with the skull on it. However, it's not as cool as the one in 4th edition, man. The one in 4th edition where he's coming at you and the scepter is glowing green and it looks like not so much a cummerbund as like gut armor.
Yeah, yeah. And he's sort of ripped in that one, right?
Yeah. He's like ripped, but he's like ripped in that way that like old like WWF superstars were ripped. It's like big muscles, big shoulders, big legs, but they got that beer gut because they're drinking road sodas when they're making towns.
Yeah. Initially, he looks very soft, I think. And as time progresses, he becomes more and more sort of like cock diesel.
Yeah, he really does look like he's on the gas in 4E.
Yeah, because I think 4E is the era that we saw the Icons of the Realms miniature, the giant miniature of him kind of like charging around. And he's pretty ripped as a miniature in that one. I think the earlier Orcus, he's still a little pot-bellied.
He's come a long way from the pencil sketch in 1st edition where he didn't even like fully have wings. It was like the guy kind of gave up halfway through. Head looks cool, but we're going to call it a day here.
Yeah, like there's a little bit of the Balrog, I think, in that, the wings.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, although Baphomet does have wings, but there's a little bit of Balrog in a lot of the stuff that comes out of Eldritch Wizardry. But I have to say that I think that the perfect illustration of Orcus happens, really early in 1980, and it shows up in Dragon Magazine 42. It's the Halloween issue of 1980, and it's a black and white illustration of Orcus by Todd Lockwood from 1980.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah, and it's great. Like, I know that image so well. It's like burned in my brain because it's so good. It's like a little bit of Gustave Doré, a little bit of Bernie Wrightson. It's like black and white, really fine line work, really good control over the light. I love it. But I never remember who did it. And I never remember who did it because it's Todd Lockwood, who is such like a 3rd edition artist to me. But here he is back in 1980, and he's totally nailing down what Orcus should look like.
And the essence of Orcus.
Yeah, he looks so bored and like decadent, and like he's surrounded by skeletons, and like it's just, I love it. It's so good. We'll definitely be using that probably as the post for this episode.
I mean, how could you not? It's fantastic.
And I think it really leans into the diabolical more than any other depiction of any of the demons and devils in D&D. I feel like this is the most evil looking one. Like this could totally be a metal album cover, or like you could find it in an occult book.
Oh, yeah.
Or actually you would find it in like pasted in a book that they get in the horror movie where they're looking up the thing that like they're scared of, and like they'll flip through it and it'll just be like, oh, there's a picture of Orcus, and like they'll be talking about like, you know, something completely not associated with Orcus, but like, you know how they do that in horror movies?
Oh, yeah. I also feel like this is the thing where they would just kind of glance up from it and they would know that it's horrifying, but they wouldn't know why it's horrifying. But we know why it's horrifying. And I
Yeah.
also think that if I'm going to take it a step further, I do agree with what you said about an album cover. I think the one misstep that Ronnie James Dio made in his entire career was not making this an album cover. Because if you slap the word Dio across the front of it,
Oh man,
I'd buy it.
I would totally buy it. The estate should like license it for like a reissue or something.
Oh, my God. I mean, couldn't you just imagine it on a 3/4 sleeve Raglan t-shirt?
Oh, totally. Totally.
Oh, yeah. The t-shirt itself would just be white, black sleeves, badass art on the front. It would definitely be an iron-on. But I digress.
Biggest mystery is that you could buy this as an 11 by 14 print, and I don't know why I haven't. Like, this should totally be on my wall.
Yeah, I'm going to edit out the point where the audience hears you clicking in real time to put it in your cart. But go on.
And I think that this is also like a really good example of the leaning too into the diabolical in 1980, like wrong timing. Like, this looks so evil.
Oh, yeah.
No wonder parents had a problem with this, you know?
Oh, yeah. If my mom had seen it during that time period of my life, I would have been dragged by the ear down to St. Clair's and made to do confession again. And everybody listening out there who grew up in the 80s, you know exactly what ear pinch I'm talking about.
It's true. Ghost used it for one of their singles covers where it's like Satan on top of the world, and like he's surrounded by like the heads of state or something, and it's, I think it's a Gustave Doré engraving, but like it's that same caliber of like just creepy enough to make it like slightly unsettling on a deeper level than you're used to.
Yeah, you definitely can't wear that to Thanksgiving.
Yeah, no.
Certainly not Christmas.
He seems festive. Anyway, so I feel like early on, your big bad demons in Dungeons and Dragons are Grazd and Zugdmoy, just because Grazd, I believe, is locked up underneath Greyhawk Castle, and Zugdmoy is the big bad of.
The Temple of Elemental Evil.
I think that Orcus kind of sneaks in at the end with the Bloodstone Pass modules, which were released yearly, I think, from 85 to 88. And there's 4 of them. It's H1, H2, H3, H4. Bloodstone Pass, the first one, is just a battle system thing. It's like orcs and goblins and armies, and it's like, whatever. It's not what we're talking about today. H2 is The Mines of Bloodstone. It's from 1986, and it has this amazing Keith Parkinson cover of, you know, priests of Orcus in a temple devoted to Orcus with like this idol, and it's so good. It's a sequel to Bloodstone Pass. It still has big, you know, army combat in it, and you've sort of gone underground into these disused mines. I believe it's a war between the Smurf Neblin and the Dirger, who are worshiping Orcus. And then you sort that out, and then Bloodstone Wars comes out in 87. That's H3. That is the first point where they go, well, wait, these were generic modules. Let's just fold Bloodstone Pass into Forgotten Realms. So this becomes a Forgotten Realms thing. Bloodstone Pass becomes Forgotten Realms canon, although this doesn't have the Forgotten Realms logo on the cover.
Really?
This was that early period at 87. They're still trying to figure all this stuff out on the fly. Like, I think this is one of the first major things that they folded into the realms to kind of give it like more detail. And Bloodstone Wars is basically just another big battle system silliness with like lots of wars. There's a small dungeon that you can visit, but mostly it's just the troop combat between you guys, who are like basically now the barons of Bloodstone Pass, and forces of Orcus and the Witch King. And all of those are in service of TSR selling the battle system, which is boring and it never really caught on. H4 is called Throne of Bloodstone. It comes out in 1988. And like I think there's a little bit of battle system stuff in it, but like you go to the abyss to the 333rd layer of the abyss, which is at this point Orcus's realm. And the whole idea is like you go there to steal his wand.
Well, that's a choice for sure.
It's for levels like 19 to 100, and they have rules to scale your characters up to 100.
To 100?
Well, you have to be to take on like a demon lord who's at the verge of like divinity, right?
Okay, so real quick sidebar. When we got you years ago, now for those listening at home, our group of friends, Stu, had been at this point only running the game for like 4 or 5 years at that point. And we bought Stu this gigantic red dragon miniature that we still have in the clubhouse. It was all the hit points, and we never actually got to fight it with miniatures because we kind of moved on to Theater of the Mind. What level would we have had to have been to fight and defeat that dragon?
Oh, like you couldn't. There's just no way. You need an army of like 20th level dudes to take that thing on. He was the pet of my big bad, who was that priest of Asmodeus. So like it wasn't going to just be like the red dragon. You're going to have like a whole bunch of other problems too. It's like, no, there's no way. If you ever met that thing on the table.
Realistically, like if it wasn't the pet of your big bad, just to get a size comparison here, what level would a group have to be to defeat that big dragon?
20th, and I think that it would still be like a toss up.
So what you're saying is a group of us at 20 have a fighting chance against that red dragon. How the hell are we going to defeat Orcus?
Well, you're not supposed to defeat him. You're just supposed to steal his wand. And then you go to the seven heavens and you're supposed to destroy it. And so this is where it gets a little interesting. So this is 1988, right?
Right.
You know, we've gone through the Satanic Panic stuff. It reached its fever pitch sort of in 85, and then it started to dwindle. But TSR was just like, we're done with this. We don't want to do this. We have a second edition of the game coming out in 1989. Let's clean house. Let's get rid of all this stuff. So H4 Throne of Bloodstone becomes sort of this way to get rid of Orcus. And players steal his wand, you send it off to heaven, and then he's simultaneously murdered by a drow goddess. And at this point, it's not revealed who that is, although it's fairly easy to kind of figure out that it's Kiransali, who is the drow goddess of vengeance. She's minor. And then they use this like part of the meta going forward. So that's why there is no mention of Orcus, because she deposes him. She takes over his realm, and then she erases all mention of him from the multiverse to keep him dead.
Well, that's petty.
Well, she is the goddess of vengeance. I don't know exactly what he did to screw her over, but under the surface, this is just a way to kind of give the demons a last hurrah before they get shunted out with second edition. There's a great Forgotten Realms source book from 1989. The Bloodstone Land source book also features another Keith Parkinson cover that's great. It's a dude fighting hand to hand with a priest of Orcus. And it's a pretty great supplement that sort of takes everything that happened theoretically in the H series modules and kind of just adds it to the lore of Forgotten Realms and sort of standardizes it, building the shared universe going forward. And at the same time, this is sort of a footnote. I found a mention of it, and I haven't been able to track down which box set it's in. Orcus also is a figure in what would eventually become Mystara, and at this point is the known world. And I believe it's in either the Master, the Immortal, or the Wrath of the Immortals box sets. One of those three, where they mention Orcus. And he's not a demon lord, he's a god, and he's a god of were-swine.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's awesome.
And it's a direct reference to like that old medieval history about the wild man, the pig-faced orc, were-swine, like the idea of lycanthropes who are literally wild men. And I just thought that was really cool that they took Orcus in this different direction, but at the same time, in the basic D&D, they also kind of, did a callback to the actual folklore surrounding the figure. And I thought that was really cool.
It makes sense to me, too, because if I was ever cursed with lycanthropy, I would be a were-swine because I'm a ham bone.
Oh, buddy. What a fate.
It would be terrible. But go on.
So, as you know, in second edition, you couldn't keep the demons down long,
Yeah.
And with Planescape, all of this stuff sort of starts bubbling up again. And they reintroduce the hells and the abyss and demons and stuff. They give them silly names, but they're back. And they make a big deal about Thanatos, which is now the 133rd or 113th layer of the Abyss, was once this other demon lord's place, but he got deposed. So they're like giving you the wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And then Monte Cook comes along in 1997 with the Great Modron March. That and its companion book, which is Dead Gods, which I think came out in 1998. Orcus is dead, but because he was almost a god, he's got that divine spark, and that divine spark is sentient and loose in the world and wants his wand back. So he goes over to the Modrons, kills their leader, Primus, using something called the Last Word, which is like the deity level of power word kill.
Wow.
And takes his place, and the Modrons do this march once every 300 years, and he forces them to do it early. And he uses that as cover to try and kind of find the wand. And the PCs sort of get involved in the craziness of this march. And at the end, it transitions into Dead Gods, where basically the location of the wand. He knows the location of the wand. You have to get it before him and keep it away from him long enough for the Last Word, the power of that power to sort of consume him, which if you play it right, he does, and he dies. And then one of his followers goes to the astral plane and gets his corpse and tries to resurrect him, and you got to stop that too. So by the end of second edition in 1998, he's dead. He's gone. He's totally annihilated. They brought him back just to kill him, and you get to do it. And then after second edition implodes, they just bring him back and pretend that none of that happened.
So what, they retcon the retcon?
Yeah.
That makes absolute sense.
And that's basically it. After that, he becomes, again, a demon lord. He doesn't seem super interesting to me anymore. But there was a moment in the 80s where I think that he was the coolest bad guy lurking in the background of Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, that's amazing, Stu. I mean, I'm looking at the different versions of him through the years and through the editions. I mean, it starts with the Donald Sutherland. Second edition, it looks like Planescape with that airy kind of floaty. Doesn't totally look like Orcus, but it's Orcus. Third edition, well, let's face it, we all remember wearing chain necklaces and Jankos, and that was the Orcus equivalent in third edition. It's like, well, we learned how to use digital photography, and we're going to put that in there, and it doesn't age well. Fourth edition, he looks like something that will kill you until you die from it, resurrect you, kill your family in front of you, then kill you again, rinse, repeat. I mean, fifth edition, he looks like a fifth edition creature at this point. I mean, what's there really to say about that? However, man, what a brutal history for a monster that, in my humble opinion, everyone knows about Orcus, but I don't really feel like he ever got his due. Like, for something that was so big to be relegated to, well, he's just another, like, demon lord now. You don't need to be, like, God tier plus to beat him.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about Orcus, I think at least for me personally, is like Orcus is cool. I like Orcus. I really like that Lockwood Orcus.
Me too.
And I don't think that anybody else's interpretation, even the Planescape Orcus, like I like it, but it's not that Lockwood Orcus. And to me, I never liked Orcus so much as I liked Orcus's servants. I love the look of his priests with that goat head hat. And they always have like the big staff with like the skull with ram's horns, and they just had a really good villain look. One of my first Planescape villains was a priest of Orcus, and I love it. I love it. They were just perfect 80s villains. And I think that's one of the things that's sort of lacking in later interpretations of Orcus, is that the focus is on Orcus, and you never get to see those cool guys with the goat hats.
Oh, I agree with you. I mean, you can tell a lot about a villain by their henchmen. Hench people, modern world. But you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
If you got the right kind of hench following you, I mean, that says a lot about your street cred in whatever realm that you're dwelling in.
It's true. I mean, like, the reason everybody wants to join Cobra is because, they have cool masks.
They really do have cool masks and great outfits and a good color palette for their outfits. There, I said it out loud.
I mean, the number of people I've seen on Twitter saying that a lifetime of 80s cartoons has prepared them for, the reality of having to wear a mask outside for coronavirus. There's something to be said for that. And I just think that Orcus had top tier hench outfits. And I think that, as shallow as that may sound, contributes a lot to the mystique.
Well, listen, I appreciate the sentiment, and I am a big fan of hench couture. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Orcus?
I think my final thought on Orcus is that it's still super weird that they have this big goat dude who's like the Lord of the Undead. I just don't get it. Does he just like the undead? Like, how did he get that job? What happened to all the highly qualified skull people?
You know, man, I imagine it was something like the beginning of the fantastic Mark Harmon 80s comedy Summer School, where he was just the last one out of the parking lot and he had to teach summer school. And for him, summer school was being the Lord of the Undead.
Yeah, I guess. I'm going to make that my headcanon, I think, that he just got stuck with it.
Stu, this is another great episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. How can the people reach you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I post rambling thoughts like this all the time.
Very cool. You can find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons. I tweet about board games now. I love board games. And you can also find my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and in life. We're trying to leave the house a little more these days. Over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you're a fan of the podcast, think about joining up to our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerepg. We've got some really cool stuff going on there. Some extra goodies for those who subscribe. And you could also join our Discord, chat with us. Stu and I are always talking with people on our Discord about games, movies, whatever comes up. So check out our Discord as well. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us, and we really do thank you for it. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.